Wait a minute. You ain't heard nothing yet.
All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
Why don't you come up sometime, see me?
Rated bar! Top of the world!
Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night.
The stuff that dreams are made of.
Hey everybody, Kirk here. I just want to say before we start the episode, make sure you follow us on Twitter.
And Facebook.
And if you enjoy the episode, make sure to leave us a rating and a comment on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
We love to hear your feedback, and you can find us on any social media by searching Silver Screen Time Machine.
We appreciate your feedback. Look forward to hearing from you.
Hello, and welcome again to Silver Screen Time Machine, Wendy and Kirk's classic film review. Hello, Kirk.
Hello, Wendy. How are you today?
I'm doing well, and I'm very excited today because we have a guest, our first guest ever.
Yay.
It is our friend Stuart from the Golden Silent Films podcast. Stuart has his own podcast. He's a local podcaster. He also podcasts about classic film. He does a lot of interesting silent film things. I always find it very detailed and interesting, your podcast. You want to tell us just a little bit briefly about your podcast?
Yeah, my show is the Golden Silent Films podcast. We cover all things silent film and silent film adjacent. So we got biographies, we got all kinds of weird minutia of the silent film industry, and it's always an interesting listen, hopefully. So thanks for having me on, guys.
Yeah, absolutely. So since we have a silent film expert, Kirk, we are going to have to talk about a silent film, I would think.
Absolutely. And let me correct you from the beginning. For the next couple of weeks, Silver Screen Time Machine is on hiatus. We are now officially Silver Scream Time Machine.
Silver Scream!
Because for the month of October, it's spooky season. We're going to cover some horror movies. We're going to go over from everything, span the whole generations that our show covers. And we're going to start going back to 1920 and the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Did I say that right?
And the Dr. Caligari sounds good to me.
All right.
Yeah.
Caligari, tomato,
So
tomato.
There's going to be a lot of German names and places
Yes.
in this episode.
Sure.
So there's
Yes.
probably going to be some mispronunciation.
Yes, I'm very fearful of this episode because,
Mispronunciation alert, yes.
yeah, I am the queen of mispronouncing things. I probably can't even pronounce the word pronounce. Yes, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, 1920. So this film, we had recently, Kirk and I, we recently talked about what we called a very pioneering film in Citizen Kane. Now, I think that you can safely say that this film is also very pioneering in some of the techniques in the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Can you talk a little bit about some of the pioneering techniques?
Yeah, one of the things that'll strike you first is it's incredibly visually striking. One of the things I like most about it is it's just a different movie. Even movies later on that it would influence and other German expressionist things, even those don't quite go as whole hog into the expressionist movement as this one does. It's very different visually, storytelling wise, camera work. It's just very different. But that's an awesome thing. That's a great thing about it, and one of the reasons I love it so much.
Yeah, it's one of the few films, I think maybe one of the first films to have a non-linear narrative, right?
Yes, yes.
And they also talk about a frame story that they do. So they have a prologue and an epilogue that frames the story.
Yeah.
One thing we definitely don't want to do that Kirk and I always try not to do on Silver Screen or Silver Scream Time Machine is to not do spoilers. So we cannot give away the ending. But we will say that there's a frame story. So the prologue and the epilogue go together, and then the in-between stuff is almost a different story altogether.
Can I say this? There is a twist ending.
Yes.
And I don't know if this is maybe, Stuart, you might know, is this the first ever twist ending like this in a movie?
As far as I know, at least of like a big time, bigger budget movie, yes. As far as I know, I believe so.
And there's not just one twist, really. There's another twist earlier as well, which we probably can talk about. Let's talk about the sets, because I think that's probably the most important part of this particular film. These sets were hand-painted. I read somewhere these are paper sets. Was it done in paper? Because they're actually opening doors and stuff. And I thought that... Is it paper?
One of the things I love the most about the sets is, kind of to your point, whenever you look at the set, it looks like it's very just superficial, just a flat line.
Yes.
But as you watch the movie, they actually are incredibly in-depth. Characters, stuff that you think is just a painted picture. People are walking upstairs that you didn't even think were real stairs. There's a lot of depth and a lot of illusion, I guess you could say, with all these sets. You're not expecting characters to just walk
Yeah.
into a doorway that...
I agree. Anytime they opened a door, I was like, whoa, how did they do that? That didn't look like it was even real. I thought it looks like a painting. But the set designer is Herman Worm. I assume that's how you say it, just like the word worm. And he brought two of his friends who are painters and stage designers, Walter Riemann and Walter Ryman maybe, and Walter Rohwig. How would you say his name? Rohwig.
German is not my
Yes, I apologize to
We're
any
all-
German people that I'm offending right now. So it was Raymond, or however you say his name, that suggested this expressionist style because he used this a lot in his own paintings, and they actually painted the sets themselves. And some of the painting they did on the sets, they didn't use dark and light lighting, but they actually used the painting to convey
To give
lighting.
those shadows
yes.
and yes,
right.
yes.
And they did use some lighting as
Yeah.
well. I think another thing that was kind of pioneering is when Caesar is killing the fellow, but it's done all in a shadow
Yeah,
with
like
lighting.
a lot of light and shadow is one of the keys to the whole movement, if you will.
In talking about the design, you watch this through a modern eye and you see the painted sets. And Wendy, like you said, it looks maybe not paper, but cardboard or something like that. It looks like theater sets. And you may think, well, that's just because, it was probably cheap, done on the cheap. But it was a artistic choice. You know, it was that expressionist feel to it. And they said the artist brought it to the director, and he said, go as crazy as you want. Now, he had a more commercial thought in mind because he thought, oh, well, if we make it look real artsy and look different, then it'll bring attention to the movie. But it wasn't a financial decision in the sense where, well, this is all we can afford. They wanted that movie to have this very specific look.
Yeah, and even the intertitles, where the words are.
That's one of my favorite parts I love, as a silent film fan, I'm a stickler, not a stickler, but I appreciate when intertitles actually mirror or address something in the narrative. There's some connection between the look of the intertitle. You get it in Blood and Sand. There's a few different movies that really go all in on the intertitles in relation to the movie, and this is definitely one of them. And they're really cool to look at, and they're worth framing on their own.
Yeah.
As a picture, they're so cool. And so
That was one of my favorite parts of the movie was the intertitles because, like you said, does it happen that often? Because I'm used to the very boring white,
That's how
very
they are most
generic
of the time,
font.
yep.
So to see something like that, so artistically done, and from what I understand, the German itself is kind of archaic, and as English speakers, we're not going to recognize that, but there's a lot of artistic decisions in the actual language used.
And in the same vein, Nosferatu, a couple years later, Nosferatu really went all in on the intertitles as well.
Sure.
That made you feel that was part of the whole experience, not just random words put on the screen.
Well, a question I had for you too, and this might be a good point to ask. I watched a restoration that was done pretty recently. Looking at that, how close what I'm watching now is to what people were seeing and hearing in 1920?
With the exception of the music, I don't know how different the music is from today, if it's a new musical
Soundtrack?
score. But what you're seeing is pretty much what was seen back
Okay.
in the day. Yeah, you're seeing... I forget where the existing prints they have came from. I think maybe one was from France, somewhere around there, but you're seeing pretty much the way it was.
There's different hues. Sometimes it has a very green hue. I think that represents more nighttime.
Yeah, the
yellow during the
tinting.
day.
Tinting,
Yeah,
yep.
tinting. There's sometimes it's a kind of pinkish red.
Yeah.
That all existed in the original
Yes, yeah,
film.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to mention that, the color tinting, when we were talking about the intertitles are also color tinted.
Something you see a lot in Nosferatu, especially Nosferatu.
Sure.
Like really did that a lot too.
Yeah, so probably one of the earlier films doing that as well. Should we maybe start talking slightly about the plot? Do we want to talk about the plot a little bit?
I could talk a little bit about, at this point in world history, going into World War, or during World War One, or
Yeah.
going into World War One, there was a lot of holding back or import blocks on outside the non-German films coming into Germany. So you had from the mid-teens, early teens, German cinema was kind of left on its own to kind of percolate and really grow because they weren't getting a lot of outside stuff. So by the time World War I ended, you had all these studios in Germany that were really primed to really start knocking it out of the park because they've had all this practice to really build up their system and build up their studios and build up their talent. So by the time World War I ended, which is when Caligari was released, they were kind of running at the peak of their powers. So this was a good time to be a German film fan.
And actually, this was one of the first German movies that they actually were able to release over in America, correct?
Yes, yeah, because after the war, there was actually the opposite. Other countries didn't want German stuff.
Right.
To the point where films that were made in Germany, they tried to downplay the Germanness of it, change titles, make it sound like it didn't come from Germany to try and sneak it in. And Caligari is one of the first to actually get through. People loved it, and that kind of opened the floodgates to more German stuff, which would lead to your Nosferatus, your Pabst films, all that stuff.
Now, you mentioned World War One. I'm just very interested in the idea of horror movies. Just why do people want to watch it? You know, being scared is not fun. That's kind of the reason I want to do this thing we're doing where we're exploring horror films is why.
Yeah.
And do you think it's possible, you know, talking about like expressionist ideas and things like that, coming out of World War One, the real life horrors these people have experienced, the war, the aftermath, do you think that has a lot to do with the ideas behind this movie, kind of bringing those internal horrors that they've experienced onto the screen?
Very, very much so. And one of the interesting things about Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is you can look at it, it's cool from the plot of the movie. When you know different things about how the plot shakes out, it changes your view on things. But also if you know world history, especially World War I and then the upcoming World War II, it really informs and gives you some goggles to look at it and see things that you wouldn't normally see. And definitely going into it, there was a lot of post-World War I stuff tied up into it. And then even when you look into, obviously they didn't make it knowing World War II was going to happen, but you can see a lot of stuff of Cesare, the somnambulist, being under the spell of a charismatic person.
A lot of those anxieties.
Making him do things that he wouldn't want to do.
Yeah.
Looking back how World War II shook out, you can definitely see going back to that, you know, kind of gives you another way to look at it from that perspective. So definitely a lot of world history does inform a lot of how it was made, why it was made.
And the screenwriters, Hans Janowitz and Karl Mayer, were very pacifist, and they really had a disdain for government authority, etc. As a matter of fact, Karl Mayer feigned madness to avoid military service, so he wouldn't have to be sent to World War I. And he was intensely examined by a military psychiatrist, and it made him really hate psychiatrists specifically, which is why he made the model of Caligari as a psychiatrist. And it is said that the film reflects a subconscious need in German society for a tyrant, as an example of Germany's obedience to authority and unwillingness to rebel against deranged authority. So...
yeah, no, you definitely see that in there. I think you have that with Caligari, and I don't want to spoil the ending too much, but you definitely see that tension there of control, even of your thoughts, of what you can think and how you can act and how you can exist in society. From what little I know of German culture and German history, it's a lot of very German ideas in that.
A little bit more about the screenwriters. I thought this was kind of interesting that apparently both of the screenwriters were in love with an actress named Gilda Langer. Actually, she is the basis for Jane, the character of Jane. She was actually supposed to play the role, but she wound up dumping them both and going off with another screenwriter, and they were like, well, you're not going to be the lead actress then. So, but
that happens.
Yeah, apparently she encouraged Janowitz to go visit a fortune teller, and the fortune teller predicted that Janowitz would survive his military service, but Langer would die. And it turns out that she did wind up dying very young at age 23 of the Spanish flu, of a lung ailment from the Spanish flu. And he did survive the military service. So they kind of use that as the basis of when, how do you say this fellow's name? I'm calling him Caesar. That's wrong.
Cesare. That's always the way I've...
Well, you're probably right. I defer to your judgment on that. But that's the scene where Cesare predicts Alan's death. That's sort of what they use as a reference.
That's how I learned not to go to fortune tellers. I don't want to. The last thing I want to do is go up with a head of steam looking for good news.
No, but
told I'm going to be dying soon.
Researching those screenwriters was really interesting because it kind of reminded me of Wizard of Oz, where you had all these real life elements that became these characters and these situations in the movies. I think one of them even said that they believe they witnessed a murder at a carnival.
Yeah.
Witnessed the murder in an amusement park where he saw a woman disappear into the bushes. This is Janowitz again. Everything happened to Janowitz, apparently. And later, a respectable-looking man emerged from the bushes, and the next day, he found out that the girl had been murdered.
That's crazy.
So whether it was at that exact time, I don't know how they got away with that when he was standing right there, but okay, whatever. Anyhow, I would like to talk a little bit about the plot of the film.
Definitely.
We kind of start off, well, this is the prologue, I guess. This fellow, Francis, the character's name is Francis, is talking to this random old man and kind of telling him, oh, this crazy thing has happened to me. This girl passes by. He says, that's my fiance, and this crazy thing has happened to me and my fiance for this period of time. And then it goes immediately into a flashback, and it starts out from the beginning of his narrative, I guess. And this is kind of the second story. And how does exactly the second part of the story start?
Starts, you get to see I believe the fair.
The fair.
You see the town.
Is Dr. Caligari coming in at that point to try to get his permit?
I believe so. Yes.
Okay,
That's when you meet Alan, his friend Alan.
Yeah.
Yes, Francis has a friend, Alan. And at some point, they see this girl, Jane, and immediately, for some reason, after having met her in 1 minute, they both fall in love with her. Which, that's the way it happened back then, right? Like 1 minute, they're both in love with her.
Horror movies, man.
Yeah, but
Everyone
meanwhile,
falls.
you also see this Caligari character, this fellow, and this guy looks very strange. And they said the physical appearance of him was inspired by portraits of the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. You can go look him up and you can see if it matches up.
And I thought the look of him had to be the inspiration for Danny DeVito as Penguin, in Batman Returns.
There's definitely
Looks the costume, the posture,
Yep.
everything. That's where he got it from.
And we should mention Werner Cross is the one that plays Dr. Caligari, and he actually, I think, was responsible for a lot of his own makeup, the way he made it himself up.
Yeah, him and Conrad Veidt both had a heavy hand in there.
Yeah, Conrad Veidt plays, how do you say it again?
Who?
Cesar.
Cesare.
The somnambulist.
I can't say that word either. So
Somnambulist.
the Conrad Veidt character.
Somnambulist is a great word.
Yes. So anyhow, we see this Caligari. He's applying for a permit. This fellow is very impatient and mad
clerk.
with him. And also, this is, I think, where you see some symbolism. The fellow's sitting on a very, very high stool. He's low. This guy is in a position of power. He's making him wait, and you can see Caligari's getting really angry. And the next thing
All
we
the
know,
chairs are high in the movie.
yeah.
I'd be very scared to be sitting down back then.
And then we find out that now this public official was killed. And obviously we realize that Caligari is behind this.
Yes.
So he's applying for this permit to have his
Somnambulist.
Yes, be an exhibition at the fair. That's the whole point of it. So he starts exhibiting this fellow, and he slept for like 23 years. Is that?
Yes, yeah, fed from birth,
Birth,
basically.
yeah.
He's been asleep.
He's been asleep since birth, and now he's waking up. And like you said, it is Conrad Veidt, who was a great German actor at the time. He actually wound up having to leave Germany because he had a wife that was Jewish, and when the Nazis and Hitler came into
Actually,
power.
the director of the film, Robert Vine, was in the same boat. He had to skedaddle on account of political reasons.
Yeah, because the Nazis came into power, and anybody who was in the acting profession, you had to sign a paper declaring what your ethnicity or your religion or whatever it was. And Conrad Veidt put Jew, even though he wasn't, just because he was going to stand by his wife, and he had to leave, and he wound up, having a successful career.
A long career. He acted almost up until his death into the 50s or 60s, I believe.
Yeah, he did have to improve his English. He knew that, and he went and did that, and he wound up actually having a career playing Nazis because of his German accent, but he did stipulate in his contract that they always had to be villainous roles. He would never play Nazis in a sympathetic light, and one of his, of course, most famous roles, I think we all know, is in Casablanca. He plays Major Strasser, one of the last roles before his death, unfortunately.
In his early career, silent career, really great horror character actor. I really like him in The Man Who Laughs.
Yes.
Great,
That's a
great performance,
yeah.
great, and another character with just a fantastic look. I don't know if he was involved in the makeup or design of that at all, but I mean,
that I'm not 100% sure of, but he definitely has a knack for pulling off these odd characters and these characters with sad backstories. He did more in Man Who Laughs, but he did a lot in this film for not having a character that really does a lot. He really makes you feel for him. He really elicits emotion and elicits caring towards him. It's a good sign of his acting skill, I would say.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and another thing they said that Krauss, who plays Caligari, and Veidt, who plays Cesare, they said that they were much more into the expressionist style of acting, very pantomime-y, and the other characters were more naturalistic, and they didn't quite get the whole expressionist thing quite as well, because Krauss and Veidt had also done other type films like this. So that's why you see them with these very distorted faces and expressions and stuff, and it's very German expressionist.
I think that works, though, because I think those two characters are the ones who kind of have to be different from everybody else. they're almost inhuman characters, so for them to behave in inhuman ways compared to the rest of the characters makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and it goes really well with the sets, with the weird, deranged kind
Definitely.
of sets. So Alan and Francis happen to be at the fair, and they ask Cesare. Alan decides he's going to ask him, when will I die? And he gets this very funny look, and he says, exactly does he say? You will not live past dawn or something? You will die before
Your time is short. You die at dawn.
Yes, okay. So, and then of course, Alan is a little unnerved by that. Also, Alan and Francis were saying to each other, well, we both really love this Jane. We'll let her decide who she wants. And then that night, you see that scene I referenced before where Cesare comes in and he's in shadow and you can see that he's murdering, and you find out, well, he's murdering Alan. But he's so frightening and menacing just by saying and doing nothing, just walking even. It's absolutely terrifying. That's what I think the horror aspect also of that. So he gets murdered, and then obviously Francis wants to sort out who did this. And this is part of the plot, that Francis is trying to find out who murdered his friend. He already suspects Caligari right off the bat. And obviously the problem of who will Jane choose has been eliminated.
Sure.
We don't have to worry about that anymore. She has no choice, but she only has Francis now.
And that's one of the fun things about the movie is it turns into sort of a quasi whodunit, sort of a detective. There's a killer on the loose. I'm going to find out who the killer is. And things happen along the way, but at least for a little bit, it kind of takes a little detour into a crime.
And it almost has that feel of, and this is probably something that inspired as like the Italian Gelato films, where you see in those, it's always the individual who takes over the investigation. And the cops, go ahead, you do your thing. But that's what happens here. Is Francis, I think he enlists the help of Jane's father.
Yeah.
And do they ever explain this? He's some kind of authority figure where he has a little more...
He's a doctor as well.
Okay.
Dr. Olson, I believe is his name.
And Francis enlists him to help with the investigation into Alan's death. And so he goes and he basically spies on Caligari and watches what he thinks is Cesare sleeping.
Yes.
And as he's watching, Cesare goes and he seeks out Jane. And he has, in a scene that's kind of reminiscent to me of Phantom of the Opera, the Lon Chaney Phantom of the Opera, he goes and he's going to try and kill Jane, but then he kind of looks at her and he seems to fall in love with her. So he grabs a hold of her, breaks out her window, he's taking her away. And at that point, they discover, is at that point that Francis realizes that it's not really Cesare sleeping?
Well, yeah, and another thing before that, we even get to the scene, they find a fellow wandering around the street with a knife that they say, oh, this is the...
Aaron,
this is the fellow that is the murderer, and they take him, and for a moment, Caligari is cleared because they do go investigate, and he says this guy's asleep, blah, blah, blah.
I have to admit, the guy was a smart criminal.
Yeah.
He had an old woman to kill, and he knew these other killings had already happened.
Yeah.
So he's like, I got to kill a woman, so I'll just do it the same way this guy
Yes.
did it, and no one will ever think of me.
Yeah.
And sadly for him, he got grabbed for all the murders. But yes.
Seemed like a good idea at the time.
But Francis is not thrown off, and the scene Kirk says occurs. And another thing to mention about that particular scene is, I think, another very pioneering editing effect is the way they're cutting back and forth between the two scenes. Him watching Dr. Caligari and then Jane being abducted. They very seamlessly cut back and forth. That wasn't really done that early in 1919 when they actually made this film.
Yeah. Stuff like that really ratchets up
Yep.
the tension and really
Yeah.
builds some anxiety.
Yeah, this is a very suspenseful film. You want Dr. Caligari to get caught. You're constantly on the edge of your seat. So what happens is he tries to abduct Jane, but he has to carry her a very long way, and he's been asleep for a long time. I don't think he's developed a lot of muscles. And they find that she's gone. They're pursuing him, so he winds up dropping her and running off. And then they realize, obviously, that Dr. Caligari is behind things, and they go to his house, and they find that he has a dummy there that he was pretending to be Cesare. But then here's the first twist that I think we can mention. But I think Francis begins chasing or following him or chasing him.
Chases him into the insane
asylum. And Francis thinks, oh, well, this guy is one of the lunatics in the
Caligari
asylum, right?
chasing
Yeah.
him.
So he's like, okay, so this makes a lot of sense. This guy's a crazy person. So he goes into the asylum to get help. They said, well, let's take you to the director. And they go to the director, and it's Dr. Caligari is the director. So that's another twist, and a smaller twist. A bigger twist comes next. But we can't say it because it will really, really spoil the film. But this film Just so beautifully done.
And I think, too, the interesting thing for me, at least as a modern viewer, I like how that tension you're talking about ratchets up. Because personally, my experience watching it, when you first see Caligari, he looks kind of comical. He has the over-exaggerated expressions, the costume, he almost looks clownish. But then as you go on, and even when he's dealing with that clerk, he's kind of subservient, he's kind of being, taking like the verbal abuse from him. But then you the layers unravel.
Yeah.
And you start to realize really what is behind this character and what his motivations are. So I really enjoyed that. That may have not been the original intention, but that's what I got out of it when I was watching it.
Well, Stuart, what do you think about this one point? I don't know if you really noticed this, but I thought this was very scared about this part where Jane comes to visit Dr. Caligari because she's looking for her father. And there's one point when both Cesare and I guess she's going to leave, and Cesare and Dr. Caligari turn and look at her, and their expressions are almost mirrored and terrifying.
There's a lot of little itty-bitty things in this movie because I've seen it a ton of times, and I'm still picking up new nuances, new facial, like that. Little things like that I'm like, I didn't see that last time.
That scene you're talking about, it's a scene where he starts out sleeping and his eyes are closed. And you really can't tell the way it's shot. His eyes open, but they still kind of look like they're closed. And it's a really bone-chilling kind of scene. And that's actually the part, I should go back, where he first makes that contact with Jane. Where he decides to go get her later. And you just feel, she seems so vulnerable at that point, too, because both of them are up to something.
Yeah.
So it's again, that tension there is really great.
And when he comes into her room and walks very, very, very slowly, it's terrifying. It's really, really terrifying.
And I think it's the physical performance of both of them, of Caligari and Cesare, really add a lot to the fear factor there.
Yeah, two really great expressionist actors.
Because Veidt walks almost like he's like a ballerina, like he has dance trained. The way his body just moves as he's walking towards her, it just adds a little something.
Absolutely.
And they were actually told to walk like dancers and to move like dancers. They were instructed to do that, I think, by the director. I thought I had that note, but I know I read that. I think it was by the director. They wanted them to move like dancers, to make it the whole dreamlike thing. Yeah. Let's talk very briefly about German Expressionism. We keep using that term, but what is it?
It's really a use of light, shadow, angles. And one of the things that's interesting about the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is that, like I said, they went all in on it for that movie, where other movies like Nosferatu, Metropolis, they were inspired by it, but they didn't take everything. They took certain shadows or certain ways things are filmed or perceived. But Caligari went all in, went 100% with it. So you really get to see it just full force between angles, lighting, and even stuff later on, like film noir owes a lot to German expressionist stuff.
Correct.
And you can actually build emotion and tension just with a shadow on the wall or stuff like that. So it definitely was a very important seminal piece of work.
Yeah, and the actors being put in sort of like a unrealistic, nightmarish type environment, and that's what the sets represent. The set, at some points, the set almost looks like a funhouse. Yeah. Honestly.
It looks like dark Dr. Seuss. Or there's not a lot of right angles.
The thing that I always attribute it to is the 1966 television Batman.
Yeah.
Where all the villain layers are always askew, they're always at angles, there's always weird cockeyed things just kind of bent weird, or cameras at angles. So that's always the first thing that comes to my mind is Adam West Batman.
Yeah, I tried to find out who the editor was. I have a feeling back then they didn't have separate editors because there was no credit for an editor at all in IMDb. So I don't know if the director did the editing or the cinematographer did the editing. I don't know which. The cinematographer on this film was Willy Hammeister. His camera work was fairly straightforward. The one thing I did like is those kind of circular dissolves that they did throughout the film.
Yeah, they do that a lot.
I really enjoyed that. I thought that was really cool, and it kind of made it telescopic almost sometimes.
And there was that double iris where they do that thing where you often see in silent movies where the camera kind of zooms in and closes off on one thing. But then there were two of those in the same scene where it would close in and then it would open up and it would close in on another part of the same scene.
Yeah, there's a lot of funky stuff going on in the movie.
Yeah.
Really, it added to the weirdness because you already got weird sets, weird characters, weird light, weird angles. Just doing those little in-camera tricks really add to the oddness.
Yeah, and the score. I know we don't know if the version we heard was the original score, but the score that I heard was very effective. I think a lot of synthesizers, stuff like that. It was very spooky, and I thought it added immensely to the film.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, going back to, and Stuart, you have more experience than I do, but I'm used to the same piano tones, rolling piano tones throughout the entire thing. And you don't get a lot of that here. You get a lot of mood setting. There's a lot of, you're at the carnival, there's a lot of pipe organ.
Yes.
And it's twisted, where it's kind of has that happy sound to it, but there's something underlining behind it. So again, I'm not sure at what point that music came into play, but it was really good.
Yeah, I can say the stuff that is with the Blu-ray version or the DVD version is really freaking good and quite enjoyable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, whoever is responsible for that, we really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
We like it a lot.
Yeah.
Did you have any further comments you wanted to make, Stuart?
I have an interesting couple degree of separation from this movie.
Oh, yes.
Which not the most interesting story, but I do film stuff on the side. I do work on movies, commercials, all that kind of stuff. And one of the first projects I ever worked on it with an actor named John Bigham. Really cool guy, great actor. And this was in 2009. And in 2005, John Bigham was in a remake of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, directed, edited, all that stuff by a guy named David Lee Fisher.
Huh.
But the interesting thing about this is they filmed it all green screen, and the performances and the sound was new, like the dialogue, and Doug Jones actually played Cesare.
Wow.
Which is a perfect
Absolutely,
casting. Yeah. But it was all filmed green screen, so they took the actual backgrounds from the original Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and put the actors on the sets of the original.
Huh.
They still had the original backgrounds.
Well, they had a green screen, so they would have it
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Maybe projected. I thought you meant the actual
No.
grid. I'm like, how did they keep the sets that long?
It's basically, for all intents and purposes, a shot-for-shot remake of Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. But they used green screen and used the actual backgrounds from the original. Yeah. So.
Oh, very interesting. Well,
and there's one other thing that I found out about this movie. From what I can tell, the makers of this movie invented viral marketing. Because
it is very interesting.
What they did was go back a little bit into the movie. There's a scene where Caligari's kind of losing his mind, or the character who's supposed to be Caligari. And he's seen the text, instead of it being on the intercards, it's actually appearing on the set.
You must be Caligari.
You must become Caligari. And it's appearing in the sky, it's appearing in walls, it's kind of driving them crazy. What they did before this movie came out, before anybody knew anything about it, they started plastering all over the city posters, "You must become Caligari." And I thought that was cool. Before the internet, before TV, before radio, just that idea of getting the word out, creating a buzz.
Yes.
That was pretty neat.
I'm actually glad you mentioned that, because I had also mentioned to say something about the editing, that's another thing that was very pioneering in the editing, that they put all those words post-production in the editing phase. So that was also really
That was one of my favorite scenes of the movie. That was really cool.
Yeah, because you just see these words come up over him and he's freaking out. And I would say Werner Cross, who played Dr. Caligari, and I don't want to badmouth him or anything, but he took a very different path from Conrad Veidt, because he became a fan of the Nazi Party and actually did a film that was anti-Jewish.
Wow.
And he got pretty much lambasted for that, and I don't think his career ever resurfaced after that. Justifiably. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So unfortunately, you have these two great expressionist actors, and they just went to completely different paths. And you can see the one who took the right path was successful, and the one who took the wrong path didn't amount to anything. So. But really good performances to me by both of those actors in this particular film. I think the director should be credited. We haven't talked much about him. Fritz Lang was supposed to direct this film, but he agreed to do a different film, Spiders or something.
Yeah, that's a very good one too.
So it fell to the director,
Robert Vine.
But they said that one of the reasons they chose him, which is kind of funny, that one of the reasons they chose him was because his father went mad.
Oh, really?
And they felt that he would understand the madness of let's say the Caligari character. Let's just say the Caligari character. Yeah. So I thought that was an interesting reason to choose a director, but I think he did a great job. We do Stuart, I don't know if you're familiar, but we like to do our star ratings. So if you folks have nothing further you want to mention, we could do our star ratings.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Okay, well, let Stuart go first because he is our guest.
What's the...
5 is the highest, 1 is the lowest. Or I guess you could say 0 if you really hated it, but...
I would say 5. I'm gonna come in with a 5. It's just incredibly memorable. There's no part of it that's not visually interesting to look at. There's no part of it that the acting's not fascinating. There's just so much going on with it. And I got to give it a 5 on that account. It lasts. It stood the test of time, 123 years. So.
Yeah, it's an amazing film.
103 years.
Oh.
My math is bad.
That's
Kirk.
right. Yeah, I'm going to go 4. I'm really solid 4. I enjoyed it. It's the first time I've seen it, and it lives up to the hype. You talk about movies that are influential, that kind of set the stage, and sometimes those movies don't hold up so well. This one definitely does. I was engaged the entire time. I love the look of this movie. I love the sound of the movie. I love the performances. So yeah, I'll definitely go very, very solid 4 on this.
And I will split the difference and do 4.5.
Okay.
Because I really think this is an incredible film, very pioneering. I'm a big fan of German Expressionists. I really like the cinematography. I really love the sets. It's just amazing to look at this film. Not even watch the film, just to look at the sets themselves, I think is so amazing. I love it. I think it's one of the best silent films out there.
And for a Silver Scream Time Machine, it had a solid body count, so
Yeah.
you can't discount that.
Absolutely. That's the thing. It is scary for old movies like that. It's just some old product of a bygone era. It's a scary movie. There's a lot of chilling stuff in it.
Yeah, and I think especially as a woman, there's a very frightening, the vulnerability of, even the man, I guess, but just this menacing person stalking. It's something I think women generally fear to begin with. So it's just like, oh, good, our worst nightmare. So anyhow, I want again to thank Stuart for coming on. We had a really nice time. We really appreciate all your great insight.
Thanks for having me. It's nice to be on a podcast where I don't have to press any buttons or check anything, so I appreciate it. Thank
Give
you.
us the name and where we can find you again,
The
Stuart.
podcast is the Golden Silent Films Podcast. It's available on all podcast outlets. If you have X or Twitter, it's Golden Silence 1 at Golden Silence and the number 1. And Instagram, we have Golden Silence Cast. So again, if you want to pop in, see what episodes we got going on, all the fun we're having, come on in. It's a Golden Silent Films Podcast.
About how many episodes do you have, just out of curiosity?
Maybe 44 now. Yeah.
We got a long ways to go, Kurt.
Coming up on the 50th pretty soon.
Awesome.
Oh, well,
Yeah.
God bless you.
Congratulations.
It's not as easy as it seems being a
No,
podcaster.
yeah.
Again, we appreciate
Thank you so much for having me.
This has been wonderful having you as our guest, and we are continuing on with our spooky Silver Scream Time Machine spooky season.
We need to get like thunder and lightning effects every
I
time
know,
we
we
say
do
it.
need some sort of a scary effect.
Yeah.
Maybe we can try to edit that in if we could learn how to edit a little better. Can we reveal our next upcoming spooky episode?
Absolutely.
Oh, good. I didn't know if we were
That's fine,
allowed.
yeah.
Okay, so what are we doing next?
Next, we are going to go to Bride of Frankenstein.
Bride of Frankenstein, and we will also have a very special guest on this show. If you're a Pittsburgher, you may know him. He's a local celebrity. Sean Collier will be coming on to talk
Very exciting.
to us about the Bride of Frankenstein. So
I'm
please.
excited to listen to that.
Oh,
It's gonna
good.
be a good one.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it. So keep tuned. And as always, check us out, Facebook and whatever they call Twitter these days. And subscribe to our podcast. And please leave us some reviews.
Yes.
We'd love to have some reviews. We'd love to hear your feedback.
Let us know if you're enjoying the show and what you think of it.
Yeah, and give us some ideas of maybe films you want us to talk about.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so we will check you out next time on Silver Screen or Silver Scream Time Machine. Wendy and Kirk's Classic Film Review. Goodbye.
See you next time. Thank you for listening to Silver Screen Time Machine.
Be sure to follow us on Facebook and Twitter.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a comment and review on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Intro music composed by Heidi Engel.
Outro music composed by Maximus Monk.
Artwork by Tyler Birch.
Produced and edited by Wendy Wittick and Kirk Kolkowski.
Recorded at PCTV Studios in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
We'll see you next time.